Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of Ouija board stories for you to enjoy. Be warned though, one of these stories does contain mention of people taking their own life. Proceed with caution. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This all happened when I was in high school, in my parents' house. And I feel like I've always been a little sensitive to the paranormal. But this house took it to an entirely new level. I have always believed in ghosts, always been obsessed with ghost shows like Ghost Hunters and A Haunting, always loved scary movies, and always said that Halloween was my favorite holiday. So when two of my best friends asked me if I wanted to use a Ouija board, of course I said yes. Now in hindsight, this was not one of the best decisions I've ever made. We went out late at night, and the small town we lived in had a cemetery right in the middle of town. So that's where we went, which I just feel like was definitely stacking the odds against us. But like high school kids, you know, there's not really much need to give you details about the experience because what happened afterwards is what's spooky. But just know that we heard a creepy child's laughter and spoke to a known Ouija board demon. And it was enough to make me never want to touch one again. Now, the activity in my house started at night, as soon as I got home. So I had to believe that they were connected. In my parents' house, my brother and I stayed in the basement, and our rooms shared a wall. This was in a small town in Nebraska, in the dead of winter, so it was super cold. And in the basement, we had one of those small infrared heaters on wheels. And that night I heard the heater rolling around on the linoleum floor. But me having seen enough scary movies, I knew that the last thing you wanted to do was check out the spooky noise, or acknowledge the thing making said spooky noise. So I stayed in my room, super freaked out, and hid under my blankets. That was the first night. And as time continued, things just got progressively worse. Do you guys remember the old metal pencil sharpeners that you used to have to spin the little handle to sharpen the pencil? For whatever reason, our house had one of those, mounted on one of the pillars outside my room, and this would start rotating at night as well as the heater. Then inside my room, I had a mason jar that sat on top of my dresser in my closet. This started moving around at night, like back and forth, on top of a wooden dresser. Like I said, I had already decided I was never going to acknowledge the spooky ghost, so I wouldn't even look in its direction. And this would go on for what felt like hours at a time, and the longer I ignored it, the more aggressive the mason jar got. I never looked at it until morning. And after one particularly rough night, when I looked at my dresser in the morning, there were scrapes on top of it from the mason jar. This had me all the way messed up, but I still hadn't said anything to my family about it. They believe in the paranormal, but they had already told me the house was fine, so I didn't want to bring it up. But now there was a tapping on the walls at night. My bedroom has wooden paneling in it, and I would hear taps next to my head. Now also, you know how it feels when your cat jumps on your bed and starts walking around trying to find a spot to lay down? I would feel that at night too. But there would be no cat, which was sufficiently creepy. But to make matters worse, I started to hear my name being whispered at night from my closet. This was happening every night, And even though I wasn't acknowledging it, it was getting worse. I'm even getting chills recalling it now, as it freaks me out so profoundly. On the left side of my bed, I had a huge wooden bookcase that my grandparents had made for me, because I love reading, and on top of that bookcase was an old little flat-screen TV with buttons on the back of it that was super, super loud when you pressed them. Those buttons started being pressed at night too. So at this point I'm hearing the heater and the pencil sharpener, taps on my wall, whispering in my closet, TV buttons pressing, and feeling stuff crawl into my bed. And as you can guess, I'm a mess. My breaking point was one specific night, when I had a super vivid nightmare. In the nightmare, I'm in my room, and I'm looking around, and as I do, I see a little girl huddled in the corner in my closet, a little boy standing by my bed and pressing on it, and a shadow man behind my bookcase looking right next to the TV, and a shadow man in the opposite corner, tapping on the wall. It was absolutely terrifying, and at this point I'm incapable of keeping it to myself anymore. I start a conversation with my brother about the nightmare I had, and this is where things get extra creepy, as if it wasn't bad enough already. I'm telling him about this nightmare, and his eyes go super wide as he's listening in, and he interrupts me, and describes to me exactly what the little boy pressing on my bed looks like. We had the exact same nightmare. So then I start telling him everything that's been happening to me, and he's nodding along, telling me that he hears the heaters, the pencil sharpener, and the whispers. To make matters worse, he tells me that I was whispering along with the ghosts. I am completely dumbfounded and ask him what he means, and he tells me that he's seen me sitting straight up in bed, talking in my sleep to whatever was in my room, which is something I have no memory of whatsoever. That is all super scary, right? But it gets worse. Right across from my brother's room, across the basement, was a storage room without a door. This room has always given me a yucky feeling, like the kind of feeling where I never wanted to even be near it or look into it in the dark, and I never knew why. My brother's room faced this door. He told me that he would wake up at night and see dark shadows that looked like a man standing in the doorway of that room. Some nights he'd be in the doorway, some he'd be halfway between his room and the storage room, and some nights he'd be standing in the doorway of my bedroom staring at me. He said the man never stepped into my room, and was never in front of my brother's room, and I never saw him. I was terrified by all of this, but if you can believe it, I felt a little better knowing that I wasn't alone in what I was experiencing. We told our parents and my dad didn't believe us, but my mum told us that sometimes she heard whispering from downstairs and would hear someone yell, "Mum," from my bedroom when she was home alone. After I told people, things started to happen less. But I remember one specific time when my boyfriend, now husband, was over, and my brother and I were telling him everything. He asked us to stop because he was getting a really terrible headache, and the second we stopped talking, it went away. I don't necessarily know how everything stopped. I ended up moving out into an apartment building and experienced a few things. Like all three of my clocks in different rooms fell off the walls and shattered at the exact same time. But I haven't experienced anything to that magnitude since. My mum and brother also told me that the second I moved out of that house, all that activity stopped completely. Literally the first night I was no longer living there. I haven't experienced anything since living in my apartment, so I don't know if I left my little ghosties there or not. But either way, I'm thankful it's not happening to me anymore. From ages 10 to 13, my family rented a house. It was a nice size home in the suburbs, built in the mid-50s, I believe. When we moved in, it was already furnished. I was in my first bedroom. I'd changed room 3 times. There was a desk in it and I was doing homework. I must have been about 10 at the time. Well, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man in black walking slightly behind me. I didn't see him fully, only from his shoulders to about his wrists. And he appeared, walked out of my peripheral vision, and when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just myself staring back at me in a mirror. But I could feel that something was wrong. I tried to go back to do my homework, but I felt very uneasy, like something was in my room. I grabbed my stuff and ran downstairs. The next time I saw something, I was sitting at a table. Again, out of my peripheral vision, I saw something, this time a woman wearing a dark pink and purple fleece. I knew it was a woman because I saw half her torso, chest, shoulder, and arms. But again, when I turned, no one was there. I should mention that there were a lot of mirrors in that house, none of which my family put there. I later saw some spiritual people say that you should never have second-hand mirrors because you don't know what they've seen. Perhaps there was something bad attached to them. The next strange thing that happened was after I had switched rooms with my mum. In my old room, I wasn't sleeping well. I started sleepwalking, my neck and back hurt from the bed, and I also became very ill. I had the stomach flu for a week, but it got so bad that I had to be hospitalized overnight for rehydration and medication through an IV. Strangely, once I was in the hospital and had the IV, I stopped throwing up. I recovered in a day. When I switched rooms with my mum, it was nighttime, and everyone was asleep. Unlike everyone else, I had my door open. I woke up to a light illuminating the hallway. At first, I wasn't scared. I felt almost at peace. But then it got brighter and started moving towards my room. Once I saw the full thing, my stomach dropped, and my blood ran cold. It was a large orb of shining light moving on its own. I don't know why I was so scared, but I could tell it was sentient. I know this because it stopped at my door frame, as if it realized I were awake and staring at it, and I know it was staring back at me. I had a form response. I was frozen. Just from the first experience to now, all of this had happened within a year. So I was now about 11, or had maybe just turned 12. But at that moment I truly felt like my life was in danger. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore, so I pulled my blanket over my head and waited for something terrible to happen. Eventually, I fell back asleep, and when I woke up it was gone, and everything seemed fine again. The next experience happened while my family and I were watching the Elisa Lam documentary on Netflix. We hadn't finished it when my grandmother and I made a makeshift Ouija board from cardboard paper and used a shot glass as the planchette. We actually summoned a spirit, or at least I believe we did, because we asked if it was the goth guy from the documentary, and it said no. The next day, when we finished it, it confirmed that the goth guy had been cleared of all suspicion. However, my grandmother made a mistake. When we were done talking to the spirit, I told her we needed to say goodbye properly, but she lifted her fingers off the glass and said goodbye without moving the glass to goodbye first. I told her we had to fix it quickly, so we tried again and did it the right way. I thought everything was fine. The next day I woke up and the fridge was leaking water. We called the landlord and he sent a repairman, but they had no idea what was wrong, why the fridge was leaking or where it was leaking from. Eventually, it just stopped by itself. Then, the footsteps in the attic started. I would hear footsteps and rustling in the attic many times throughout the day. I was so sure someone was up there that I had my aunt go look, but no one was. I would also hear footsteps walking around upstairs, even when I was home alone. Then the landlord decided he wanted to move back in, so we left. And after that, everything stopped. The footsteps, the things breaking, the sightings of entities and partial people, the extreme illness, everything. In the house I live in now, none of it happens. I forgot to mention earlier, but after switching rooms with my mum, our house became infested with stink bugs. Winter and summer they were always there. Eventually I discovered they were congregating in my room. When I pulled back the curtain, the entire thing was filled with stink bugs. I had never seen an infestation like that before, and eventually I moved bedrooms again. If anyone could help me understand what all of this was, especially the glowing orb, I would certainly appreciate it. The first time I ever used a Ouija board, I was 11. It was me and my two friends, Katie and Taylor, hanging out at Katie's house on a rainy afternoon. At some point, Katie's older sister Lauren and her friend Sam called us upstairs, saying they had something to show us. When we got to Lauren's room, they were sitting cross-legged on the floor with a talking board between them. It was pink and sparkly, with a cartoon kitten in the middle. Definitely not what we expected a Ouija board to look like. We laughed, but they insisted we try it. We all sat down in a circle and placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and within seconds it began to move fast. It slid smoothly across the board and spelt out one word: run. Katie, Taylor and I all yanked our hands back at once, completely freaked out. Lauren and Sam burst out laughing, saying they'd made it move to frighten us. Katie got mad and started yelling at them, accusing them of being immature. But before anyone could respond, the bathroom light across the hall flicked off, and then a second later turned back on. Everyone froze. Taylor tried to brush it off. "Okay, you got us. We're done now." But this time, Lauren and Sam weren't laughing. They looked pale and tense. Something had shifted. Then the planchette started to slide across the board again, but none of us were touching it. It moved slowly and deliberately across the board towards me. I was sitting opposite everyone else, just a few feet back. "Ha ha, very funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You just pushed it with your foot or something." But Lauren and Sam didn't laugh. They didn't even move. They just stared at the board, both of their faces drained of color. Sam's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "That's not us." Then Lauren added, "Guys, go now." We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted downstairs, not bothering to look behind us. Once outside, Taylor and Katie demanded to know if it was another prank, begging them to just admit it. But Lauren and Sam weren't talking. They were on the verge of tears, barely able to breathe and shaking. Out of instinct, I turned to look up at the bedroom window. The bathroom light switched off again, and then, I swear to God, I saw a small, dark figure about the size of a child sprinting past the window. There was no one else home. Lauren and Katie's brothers were both away at college, and their dad was at work. Their mum still out running errands. That room should have been empty. That night, Katie and Taylor slept over at my place. Lauren stayed with Sam. And no one mentioned what happened again, not once. We never brought it up. Never talked about it, not even years later. Not long after, the three of us, me, Katie, and Taylor, had a major falling out, and I never saw Taylor again. It's been 18 years now. Katie and I reconnected on Instagram recently and chat occasionally, but we've never spoken about that night. And honestly, I'm not sure if I ever want to. This happened almost a year ago in November. I used to live alone in my house, which itself is an area where not many people live. Back then I was pretty bored, as I hadn't been talking to my friends so much and wanted to do something exciting. That's when I saw the opportunity. I used to be fascinated by the concept of Ouija boards, though I wasn't a believer, but I still wanted to try it to see what would happen. The fateful night arrived, and at around 2 a.m. I set my plan in motion. First, I needed the board itself, and after a quick internet search for designs, I crafted my own makeshift Ouija board out of a sturdy piece of cardboard. It wasn't fancy, but I figured it would suffice. As darkness settled, I prepared the room. The location was already unnervingly quiet, typical for such a secluded spot, and especially so late at night. The only sounds were the occasional chirps and buzzes of insects outside, which only served to amplify the silence within. To add to the atmosphere, I lit a single candle. Why? I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps I thought it would make the experience more authentic, or maybe I just liked the eerie glowing cast. With the curtains drawn and the solitary flame being the sole source of light, painting the room in a dance of shadows and illuminating the quiet oppression. Heart pounding slightly, I began the session. I moved the planchette hesitantly, using prompts I had seen on other people's online accounts. "Is someone here?" I asked into the stillness, and waited, every nerve on edge, then proceeded with other inquiries, all of a similar nature. I gave it ample time, but the planchette remained stubbornly still. Despite the lack of physical movement, I was undeniably frightened. The combination of the isolation, the candlelight, and the general strangeness of the situation had created a chilling atmosphere. My imagination was running wild, filling the silence with a sense of anticipation and dread. Then the unexpected occurred. I was sitting on the floor, facing the door to the room, when I heard a loud and distinct bang. The metal latch on the door rattled sharply, and a shadow flickered in the sliver of light beneath the door, as if someone or something had moved past it. It scared me more than I could have imagined. My immediate reaction was to halt the whole thing. I blew out the candle and without a second thought, which I quickly realized was a huge blunder, plunged the room into complete darkness. Disoriented, I struggled to remember where I'd left my phone, and scrambling to my feet trying to find the way to the light switch. That's when something else happened. It was fleeting, and I can't say for certain that it was, but I thought I heard footsteps in the room that weren't my own, as I was wearing socks and my movements were almost muffled to a point of silence. But these sounded like someone running, only for a brief moment, directly into my direction. Panic seized me. As soon as I finally found the switch and flooded the room with light, I grabbed my phone and bolted. I fled the room and retreated to the perceived safety of my bed. But sleep was impossible after that. My mind raced, replaying the events and wondering what exactly had taken place. Eventually, I managed to doze off after scrolling on my phone for a while, trying to calm my nerves. The next morning, my resolve was firm. I wasted no time in disposing of the homemade Ouija board, throwing it straight into the trash. I wanted nothing more to do with it. However, the unsettling experiences weren't quite over. 2 nights later, I woke up in a daze and found myself standing in the outside corridor of my house. It's possible I had sleepwalked, but the realization sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly returned inside and locked the door, and haven't touched a Ouija board since. My high school days back in the early 2000s were marked by a shared fascination among my friends and me with the supernatural, particularly with the Ouija board. It became a regular activity for our group. We'd gather in someone's basement or bedroom, dim the light some candles, and try to make contact with the other side. Our very first attempt was chilling. We were in the middle of a conversation with the board when suddenly a wave of intense cold swept through the room. It wasn't just a slight chill, it was a powerful creeping cold that seemed to rise from the floor and permeate the air. It was so jarring that my friend, visibly spooked, instinctively grabbed his hunting knife, which he happened to have nearby for some reason. Even his dog, normally calm and collected, bolted from the room with its tail between its legs. We cautiously asked the board if it had caused the sudden temperature to drop, and the planchette moved deliberately to spell out that it wanted us to feel how it had died by drowning in icy water. The sheer intensity of the cold and the specific answer left us all shaken. On another occasion, our friend was deeply grieving the recent taking of her cousin's own life, and she wanted to try and connect with them through the board. To ensure there was no subconscious manipulation, we made her agree not to physically touch the planchette. Despite this, the board remarkably began to spell out accurate details about her cousin. It gave his full name, his girlfriend's name, the college they had attended, and even specific details about how he took his life that were only known to the police and close family. This experience was particularly unsettling because it suggested something beyond our own imagination was at play. There was also the time we decided to ask the entity if it was physically present in the room. As soon as the question was asked, the planchette turned sharply and pointed to a specific corner. At that very instant, all the flames of the candles we had lit flickered and shifted in that exact direction. It was a simultaneous and undeniable occurrence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After that, we made a point to avoid that corner whenever we used the board. But the story that truly haunts me is the one I find difficult to discuss. It happened when we had one of our more religious friends suggest we try contacting our guardian angels. One by one, each person's angel revealed itself, each with names that sounded distinctly biblical. However, when it was my turn, the name that came through was something else entirely. It had a distinctly demonic feel to it, echoing names like Pazuzu, Lamashtu, Aziel, and Beelzebub. As an atheist-raised Catholic, I didn't believe in demons. But even so, something about this name unsettled me deeply. I refused to speak the name aloud like everyone else did. It felt like a palpable presence, almost like an oppressive awareness, as if I were being watched with the eye of Sauron. Just thinking about the name brings back that feeling, and I honestly tried to avoid even entertaining the thought. These are just a few of the many strange encounters we had. I haven't touched a Ouija board in years now. The uncertainty of who or what we were actually communicating with has left me wary. My husband keeps one in our basement, but I refuse to be present whenever he and his friends decide to use it. I simply can't bring myself to relive those unsettling experiences. It was sometime during the summer of 2024, a period marked by long, languid days and a sense of youthful invincibility, that the idea took root among our group of 5 friends. Fueled by late-night talks of the paranormal and perhaps a touch of teenage bravado, we decided to construct our very own Ouija board. The location for this potentially ill-advised endeavor was the house of one of our friends. The house itself held a certain mystique, and on the chosen night, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and nervous energy. We gathered in the designated room, curtains drawn against the encroaching darkness of the summer night. The only illumination came from the flickering dance of 5 humble candles, casting long, distorted shadows. We sat in a circle around our homemade Ouija board, a palpable sense of excitement mixed with growing unease, settling in upon us. I've always harbored a belief in the paranormal, a fascination with things that lie just beyond our everyday perception. However, on that particular night, a part of me remained skeptical, assuming that our amateur attempt at contacting the other side would likely yield nothing more than our own imaginations running wild. We began the session as most do, politely introducing ourselves and asking rudimentary questions, our fingers lightly resting on the makeshift planchette. Initially, the responses we received were nonsensical jumbles of letters, leading me to suspect that one of us was subconsciously, or perhaps even deliberately, moving the planchette. The rational part of my mind sought a logical explanation, a way to demystify the experience before it even truly began. But then everything shifted. The seemingly random movements of the planchette coalesced into coherent answers, directly responding to our inquiries. A tangible shift occurred in the room. The air felt heavier, and a collective breath was held as we realized with a growing sense of disbelief that we had seemingly made contact. After a period of hesitant questioning, a sudden, sharp scream pierced the stillness. One of my friends, his face pale with shock, pointed towards the staircase. 3 of us were positioned with our backs to the stairs, oblivious to whatever had caused his outburst. However, the remaining 2 confirmed his terrified calm. They'd seen a figure, fleeting and indistinct, peering over the railing. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. While the possibility of something supernatural was what we had sought, the actual manifestation sent a shiver of genuine apprehension down my spine. But the experience did not conclude there. No, sir. A moment later, the lights in the adjacent bathroom began to flicker on and off with an unsettling rhythm. The bathroom, however, was empty. We could clearly see through the open doorway. There was no logical explanation for the erratic behavior of the lights. It was at this point that a collective wave of fear washed over us all. Panic, raw and instinctual, began to take hold. In our heightened state of alarm, we committed a cardinal sin of Ouija board etiquette. Without uttering the customary goodbye, we abruptly broke contact with whatever entity we had engaged, and driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, we rushed to investigate the bathroom and the scene of the inexplicable light show. But the bathroom was, of course, utterly vacant, offering no clues nor explanations for how everything had transpired. A feeling of relief and unease remained, and we cautiously returned to the Ouija board. Despite our earlier fright, a strange compulsion drew us back. We attempted to re-establish contact with the same entity, our figures hovering over the planchette. Initially, there was nothing but silence and the steady flicker of the remaining candles. And then, with no discernible draft or external influence, 3 of the 5 candles abruptly extinguished themselves, plunging a significant portion of the room into deeper shadow. The sudden darkness was punctuated by an even more startling occurrence. The plastic lighter we had been using, which had been resting on the table beside the board, suddenly propelled itself halfway across the entire hallway, skittering and bouncing until it came to rest against the closed door of the very bathroom that had been the source of our earlier terror. At that point, a unanimous decision was reached. We were undeniably out of our depth. The playful curiosity that had initiated our experiment had been replaced by a genuine and overwhelming fear. We finally remembered the importance of proper closure, and with trembling voices, we collectively said goodbye to whatever we had disturbed, seeking solace in numbers and a return to normalcy. We contacted other friends, and soon the house was filled with more familiar sounds and less oppressive shadows. Yet, even with the arrival of our friends and the attempts at distraction, the unsettling events of the evening were not entirely over. Later, the lights upstairs, in a part of the house that should have been unoccupied, flickered independently. And when some of us ventured upstairs to turn them off, several of the lights inexplicably switched themselves off before we could even reach them. That night remains etched in my memory, a vivid and unsettling experience that never fails to send a shiver down my spine whenever I recount it. Thankfully, nothing more terrifying happened after that, and I think it's best to not play with Ouija boards as a general rule. During my freshman year at BSU, spanning from 1989 to 1990, I was deeply involved in the world of the paranormal, though primarily from a skeptical standpoint. I considered myself an amateur paranormal investigator and debunker. This interest had taken root in my 6th grade years after reading my first book on ghosts, but my approach was always to seek logical explanations first, reserving the possibility of the paranormal only when conventional reasoning fell short. It was during this time that I began dating a girl called Laia. She possessed an old Ouija board, a fact that immediately piqued my interest. Laia believed the board had a dark history, claiming it was created by a satanic witch. One evening before dinner, we decided to experiment with the board in her room. Our session involved the typical question and answer format, the planchette gliding across the letters and numbers in response to our inquiries. And after some time, Laia's mother called us down for dinner, bringing our session to an end. We carefully placed the Ouija board back in its box. In a seemingly casual gesture, Laia then tossed the box board onto her dresser, where it landed on top of her Catholic Bible. We then proceeded downstairs to eat. Following dinner, we returned to Laia's room to prepare for an outing to the movies. However, as we entered, we were met with a startling scene. The Ouija board was no longer on the dresser. It lay on her bed, the planchette resting on the surface. The box that had contained the board was now on the floor. Even more peculiar was the fate of the Bible. It had fallen from the dresser and landed in the waste paper basket situated beside it. It's important to note that Laia and her mother were the sole occupants of the house. Her father had passed away several years prior, and she had no siblings. This eliminated any possibility of another person having entered the room and staged this unsettling scene. The inexplicable repositioning of the Ouija board and the Bible deeply unnerved Laia. She decided she wanted to rid herself of the object immediately. As it happened, we were scheduled to attend a Catholic youth group retreat the following weekend as chaperones. Laia resolved to take the Ouija board with her to the retreat, planning to dispose of it in the large bonfire that was traditionally part of the event. True to her word, that is precisely what we did. Upon explaining the situation and our intentions to the priest overseeing the retreat, they were initially hesitant. However, they eventually and reluctantly granted us permission to burn the board, stipulating that we should do so discreetly and avoid making a spectacle of it for the high school students present. When Laia removed the Ouija board and tossed it into the flames, an unsettling event occurred. Sounds began to emanate from the nearby woods, noises that could only be described as someone screaming in agonizing pain. While our imaginations might have played a role, the sounds were chilling and reminiscent of someone being severely burned. Understandably shaken, the priest then offered a blessing for both of us and the ashes of the Ouija board, which we subsequently gathered and buried. Fortunately, the remainder of the weekend passed without any further unusual occurrence. Laia and her mother also reported no subsequent issue at their home. However, the piercing screams that echoed from the woods that night remained a vivid and disturbing memory, a sound that was never repeated during the rest of the night or the following day, leaving us with a lingering sense of unease and a first-hand experience that blurred the lines between skepticism and the paranormal. I was a crazy girl growing up, and I've always been fascinated with ghosts and demons and haunted stories. One time I went to my friend's house, and she pulled out a couple of pencils. We played a game called Charlie Charlie. This game basically connects you to a spirit called Charlie, and you get to ask him yes or no questions, and depending on the way the pencil moves, dictates whether it's a yes or a no. I thought this game was absolute BS, until one of my friends took a photo of us playing the Charlie game together. There was a red circle surrounding me and my friend in the photograph, and ever since then, I believed in the Charlie Charlie game. I was around 15 when I played this game for the first time. When I was 16, I was admitted to St. Vincent's, as I tried to take my life a few times, so my school sent me there for a few months. At the time, there was a program where you were able to basically go to school to the mental hospital from 8 o'clock in the morning to 3 p.m. It would usually go like 8 a.m. when you came in and had breakfast, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. was a therapy session, and 10 a.m. to 11:30 was recreation time. Rec time was held at the gym, on what looked like an abandoned stage. I wasn't sure why this was allowed, but behind the stage there were a lot of glass bottles and a lot of cardboard. Usually the people looking after us didn't really keep a good eye on us, so we were able to break glass bottles and create a Ouija board with the cardboard we found. We did the Ouija board as best we could and began playing immediately. We felt the glass move and were all very freaked out. Basically, a boy called CJ came to use the board with us. Obviously, I didn't believe in any of this. I felt like the girls I were with were just moving the glass piece around the board. Until CJ told me my dad's middle name, my brother's middle name, and mine. I had never told anyone my dad's middle name or my brother's, but maybe I could have mentioned them? As the days go by, we continue to talk to CJ on the Ouija board, and he tells us the story of how he passed away. CJ said that he was 8 years old when he was admitted into the mental hospital because he had tried to take his own life because his uncle had tried to touch him. He got sent to the mental hospital, and a little while after he was successful in taking his own life, and he said that he saw a light, but he didn't want to go because he wanted to stay with his family. We continued to play with the Ouija board for about 2 weeks. We were just messing around, asking CJ questions, trying to convince ourselves that this was real. Sooner or later, CJ was gone. We asked who we were speaking to, and they mentioned this Latin name. We looked up the Latin name and it was something scary. That's all I remember. We tried to discard the Ouija board after that. We couldn't set it on fire because we didn't have access to lighters. And we got checked for stuff before we were able to enter the building. So what we did was ripped it into pieces and buried it in the backyard. I'm not sure if this was the right way. It probably wasn't. After about 6 months of going to school at the mental hospital, I ended up going back to real school, and that same day I went back to school I got sent back, but inpatient this time. I was going insane. I was also getting bullied, but that's beside the fact. 2 weeks impatient, I came home, and a lot of weird things started happening. At my parents' house, we had a living room door. It's like a really heavy door, and it would sometimes get stuck on the carpet when you would want to close the door, so you'd have to really push. One time, the door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't think much of it. A few days later, my dad was telling my mum about how the bathroom window slammed shut out of nowhere when he was taking a bath. He thought it was really strange because with the kind of window we had, it can't slam. The paint would also get sticky sometimes, so it'd be really hard to open or close the window. But regardless, there was a mechanism that held it open. So for it to slam shut, someone had to slam it shut for real. After I heard that, I let them know about the living room door, and my mum asked, "What games am I playing? Did I bring the devil into the house?" I told her what I did in St. Vincent's. I told her the game that me and my friend would play, and she immediately called my grandmother to get holy water and bless the whole house and everyone in it. They specifically overly blessed my room. And from that day on, nothing strange happened. These are real stories, by the way. This is my real life experience, and none of this is made up. I'm just glad to be rid whatever we brought with the Charlie game. About 3 years ago, I was friends with someone who had never experienced the paranormal and was intrigued by my stories. He said he wanted to try a Ouija board to see what would happen. Now, I had only tried once before when I was around 14. My 2 other friends of 12 and 14 and I decided to make our own and use a glass. We agreed not to do it in the house, but in the big shed out back. So, there we were, sitting in the dark with our fingers on the glass when one friend sneezed and moved the pointer. This resulted in my other friend and me screaming, throwing the glass and bolting outside into the light. Since my friend wanted to try it, I felt like we had to have another go at it, especially since it had been 20 years since my last attempt. So I bought a cheap laminated paper board off eBay, and we went to a park outside of town that night. We tried it, but nothing happened. We decided we needed an actual board, so I ordered one made of wood from eBay. While waiting for the delivery, we often went to this park at night to swing on the swings and look at stars, which were more visible out there. One night a few days before the board was delivered, we went back to the park. To get there you have to park, walk across from the train tracks and past the train station itself. It's not really a stop for trains anymore, only for events, but a number of coal trains do pass through it. As we were walking across, like we had many times before, I reached the platform and suddenly something felt off. Instinctively, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt like something evil, I guess would be the closest word, was present. I told my friend I wasn't going any further and wanted to leave immediately. He thought I was being stupid, but then noticed the panic etched on my face. That's when we heard what sounded like a baby crying down the tracks. He immediately agreed that we should go. As we turned and began walking away, we heard the same sound again, only louder, and right behind us. We didn't look back. We just ran to the car and sped off. He was terrified because this was his first experience, and I was terrified because I'd never felt anything like that before. We never went back. When the Ouija board finally arrived, we decided to go somewhere else at sunset to try it. This time the pointer actually moved. My friend accused me of moving it, but I told him I wasn't stupid. He decided to tap his fingers on the pointer in a way that wouldn't make it move, just to see if it was moving on its own. I got annoyed and told him that it needed constant energy to move, and he was constantly breaking the connection. Eventually, he stopped messing around and took it seriously. Now you might be thinking, what if he was moving it? Or what if I was? Well, we used our phones as a light source as the sun had set. When you moved the pointer yourself, it made a slight noise as it slid across the board. But when it was moving on its own, you could see the light from our phones passing under the pointer, as if we were hovering just above, and made little to no sound. The board first started counting down from 9. We knew if this happened, we needed to say goodbye, so we did. Then it started moving again and answering our questions. We asked if it was a ghost, and it said no. We asked if it was a spirit, and it said yes. We asked its name, and it said it had none. We asked about the things at the other park, and it warned us not to go back there because it was evil. Safe to say I never did, nor did I want to. I'm no longer friends with this person, so I don't care if he goes back, but I know I won't. About a month later, I was discussing this incident with a few colleagues from work, and they told me the train station used to be a camp for workers when the tracks were being built way back when. Families used to live there, and apparently young children would sometimes wander off and fall into wombat holes never to be found. After that, I no longer went stargazing at night in isolated parks out of town. Even sharing this freaked me out again, but I'm glad I get the opportunity to do so, and I hope you've enjoyed my story. It all started in 2019. For context, at this point, I was an 18-year-old male, and had just entered further study in a medium-sized town on the east of France. My degree is not at all common, so there were only about 10 people studying my course this year. I quickly made friends with 2 people, 2 boys, one a year older than me, and the other a few years older. We got on really well, and in the space of a few weeks, we already felt like we'd known each other for years. We discussed every conceivable subject. The subject of belief and the paranormal came up soon. I was brought up in an atheist family, but that doesn't mean I'm atheist. I was more into spiritual research because the subject really fascinated me, and I felt a need to delve into it. My other 2 friends, Antoine and Karim, were also both on the spiritual path, but Antoine seemed more interested in the question as long as we saw him as advanced. He talked about shamanism and other New Age beliefs. As I didn't have a fixed idea about these things, I was impressed. The gift. As we talked about it, we were tempted to try an experiment. Antoine's birthday was coming up, and Karim decided to give him a Ouija board. That evening we decided to get in the spirit of things at Antoine's house by turning off the lights, closing the shutters and lighting candles. It was a first for all of us. I was of course well versed in horror films, and what went on in them, but deep down I thought this wasn't going to work. However, very quickly, the drop began to move on the board. Somewhat surprised, I remained silent, and Antoine did the same. Karim, for his part, took the lead and asked fairly basic questions. Who are you? What's your name? I should point out that despite my skepticism about the practice, we did things respectfully and without laughing as other people might do. As time went by, my skepticism grew and said it must be the ideomotor effect. Karim suggested that I remove my fingers and ask questions only I could answer. Quickly and stupidly, I asked to speak to someone from my family. Something seemed to come up. I asked who it was, and immediately a letter appeared, and then another, until a name was formed. That was of my grandfather, who had died 2 years earlier. I could feel the blood in my body run cold, because I'd never mentioned him to my friends. To be sure, I kept asking for more specific questions that I'm sure Antoine and Karim had absolutely no idea the answers to. Everything fit. Confused, we ended the session, and immediately afterwards I felt exhausted. I went home that evening and slept like a log. We had more sessions, but the further we went, the more cynical, imprecise, and often mocking the answers became. I was beginning to wonder if we weren't being played, because yes, at that point I was convinced we really were talking to someone by the board. More and more, things began to go wrong for me. Once, after a session, I almost threw up because I felt such an excruciating tightness in my chest. I became irritated and nasty with my friends. A few months later, Karim told me that one day in class I had spoken to him in such a horrible way he'd been genuinely hurt by my behavior, something I have no memory of. I had a lot of mood swings, and people close to me really wondered what was going on with me. For me, I was thinking about the stress of studying, and above all the thought of something irrational in my life. Even someone who doesn't really believe in all of that will start feeling things in their life, be afraid of a dark place and so on. It's quite a human reaction. You don't believe it, but you can at least think about it. These events lasted about 2 years with fluctuations. Sometimes it was very strong, and sometimes it was more or less calm. But there were also external factors in these behaviors. Like, during a session in my home this time, Karim asked for a physical manifestation of the entity we were talking to, and several bangs of different entities were heard in my wall. And the ironic thing is that there's no neighbor behind that wall. On another occasion during a session, a question whose title I can no longer remember, the answer we received was death. Just then the candle we had on a piece of furniture went out. That same candle lit up again immediately at the end of the session. It may seem incredible, but it was all filmed by Karim, who wanted to keep a record of these sessions. Even though I don't speak to him anymore for other reasons, the video must still exist in the memory of his phone if he hasn't deleted it. I often saw small shadows moving very quickly from the corner of my eye in specific places in my flat. I should point out that when I was young I had already seen shadows moving very quickly between 2 hedges, and I recently learned that my father had seen something similar too. These visions didn't happen in the evening, but rather in the early afternoon. My window looked out onto a moderately busy street, and I was doing some housework in the afternoon when I saw a woman in white staring at me from the street. Half a moment later, she had vanished. Sometime later, I was taking my bins down to the cellar, very gloomy, and as I was leaving the premises, I saw a man on my left, in front of another door. I turned to greet him thinking he was my neighbor, but nothing. The man was wearing a hat. It was only after some research that I learned of the existence of what others call the Hat Man. As I was eating while watching the series, the bread on my left jumped 10 centimeters before falling back in place at the exact same location on the table. I thought it was an earthquake, but nothing else had moved. When I told my friends about the jumping bread, no one believed me, and they obviously laughed at me. I lived in my flat for 5 years and went through 2 relationships fairly quickly. My ex once broke up with me in a panic because she'd seen the bathroom door open by itself. Another ex saw the same thing and told me she didn't understand that, despite being a very rational soul, she'd been confused. I should point out there were no windows open. What's more, the door to my bathroom closed by itself, probably because of the incline in the floor. But in the cases where my exes had seen the door, it was the other way around. In other words, you had to push it. One evening on my way home, the empty water bottle, the one I had put next to the bin, fell over and rolled onto my feet. Well, that could have been easy to explain. It might have moved, something that made the wind blow the plastic without contents is very light, which explains the movement. But that's only one of the reasonable things that could happen with an explanation. There was one time my ex and I were cooking and the TV was on. It was a cheap TV, and the remote control didn't work all that well. You had to really be in front of the TV to increase the sound or change channels. The remote control was on the kitchen table, so not in front of the TV at all. But the sound increased drastically, so much that I asked my ex to stop, thinking she was turning up the sound. She didn't have the remote in her hand, and the next day the same thing happened, but the sound increased more episodially, as if someone had pressed the button several times and wasn't holding it down. Karim and I went to a church, and he sat in the front row. After a while, I decided to leave the church and go sit on a wall facing the wide open door of the building. I can still see Karim with his back to me sitting in the front row, when suddenly a noise drew my attention to the right, and I looked around for a few moments and looked back at the church and saw Karim leaving. I asked him how he could have got out of there so quickly. He told me that when he heard me coming out, he got up too. In short, I should have seen him walk towards the exit, but I didn't. There was obviously no one in the room. There was obviously no one in that church, apart from us. One evening, after an event with Karim, he was leaving my house to go home when he called me to come downstairs. When I went to look, I saw a rosary on the doorstep. He told me he'd called me straight away, almost having stepped on it on his way out. 2 weeks later, I got home and on my doormat, the door to my flat this time, there was another wooden rosary. I took it with me and still have it. So in conclusion, after using the Ouija board, I thought I was going mad for about 2 years. And despite periods of calm, the events kept coming back. I swore I'd never do it again or any other form of divination or spiritualism. I did many of the things I needed to do to stop the manifestations. With time, Anton stopped studying and went back to his native region, and I stopped talking to Karim. Today I'm closer to Christianity and haven't really had anything as disturbing as I'm used to. Once again, this is just one experience among many, and I don't claim to hold any truth. Some say I'm paranoid, ridiculous, or crazy, or whatever. But I think that I made a huge mistake placing my fingers on that board that night. And if I have any advice for you, it would be not to touch on, whether you believe it or not. I grew up in a very old house in the Midwest that my parents got for a steal. It was originally built as a hotel, and the seller was very motivated to get rid of it. Growing up, weird little things happened all the time. The typical malarkey that's easy to ignore for years and years. Footsteps, strange shadows, the feeling of being watched or followed, swearing you see someone in the room right as you wake up. The room in the basement that chills your blood every time for no reason. The occasional hard-to-explain moments. We moved to the West Coast in the 20s for school and self-discovery. During a visit from my family, my sister told me they had met a ghost in the house. I was pretty skeptical, but my entire family backed her up. She was in her room and her radio had been acting up. So just on the off chance, she said, "Okay, if you're a ghost, can you please stop it?" The radio turned off. She waited a moment and said, "Wait, if you're a ghost, turn it back on." After some experimentation, they devised a system of communication. Volume up was yes, volume down was no. The digital readout on the volume was 0 to 30, so 1 was A, 2 was B, 3 was C, and so on. If the radio turned off, then it was a sort of hard no, or off-limits question. Through this system, the ghost had explained that it wanted to be called Jason. He had died in the house at 1905 at age 5 when he was sick, and he lived in the house alongside us with his kind mother and evil father. When they asked if he loved his father, the volume went to 0 and switched off. In fact, he refused most questions about his father. Apparently, he was the cause of the more malevolent experiences that people had in that house. I was definitely intrigued and went back home that year to visit for a chance to experience it myself. However, when I arrived, Jason refused to interact with me. I would leave the table and the radio would pop on. My sisters would call me and the radio would turn off instantly. He didn't want to have anything to do with me. As I thought about this, I remembered an experience I had before moving to the West Coast. I had been lying in bed one night when I felt a hand ruffle my hair playfully. I freaked out. I shot out of bed, turned on the light, puffed out my chest overconfidently and yelled, "You don't know who I am or what I'm capable of. If you try that again, you'll regret it. Don't you dare mess with me." And of course, in reaction, several picture frames on my desk flew off my floor belligerently. I stayed at a friend's house that night. One night on my trip after Jason refused to talk to me, I spoke out loud, "Hey, I'm sorry if it was you who I yelled at that night. I bet you were trying to play or introduce yourself to me and I got scared. I didn't mean to be so mean to you, and I understand if you don't want to talk to me." The radio turned on. "Hey, are you the Jason I've heard so much about?" The volume went up. "Did I tell you that night before I left?" The volume went up again, and then went back down to a reasonable level. "I'm sorry about that. Can we be friends?" The volume went up again. It was incredible. He had introduced himself to several family friends as well, to prove he wasn't some sort of hack. He would do additional tasks like ring our doorbell, push crayons around on the table. You see, while asking about the logistics of being a ghost, he had volume upped that he could travel anywhere almost instantly. To test it, we called up a family friend on the West Coast. The friend put out a newspaper on their kitchen table. Jason then visited them and came back to set the volume to the date of the paper. The radio turned off for a moment, then seconds later it set the volume to 17. The friend said so close the paper was for the 18th. But Jason was not convinced. Volume up, down, 17, volume up, down, 17. The friend checked again and apologized. "Oh, he's right, it is from the 17th. He refused to answer questions that pertained to God or religion. He gave us a few answers that contradicted as well. He told us he didn't need sleep, but he told my sister he did a few months earlier. One thing he seemed to know was how long he'd be there. Through the volume Ouija system, he told my sister he would be around until around her 28th birthday. Then his family would move on. At the time, this was a few years into the future, and sure enough, we never heard from him after that. During his time with us, he would occasionally visit our dreams. We would have these extremely realistic dreams where a boy in a white-hooded robe would say hi to us and play hide and seek with us, or ask us questions. He would confirm with my sister he had visited us. He used the radio primarily, and in the final years he got better at manipulating other electronics. It was a wild few years with that crazy kid haunting our devices. My family still has the radio out just in case, but it hasn't turned on in years, and my sister is now well into her 30s. I know this will be met with a lot of skepticism. Even I was very skeptical until I was able to meet him myself. However, I think it's finally time to share this, and to answer questions people might have. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's collection of Ouija stories. I'm sorry for not posting this yesterday. I appreciate many of you must have been anticipating it. Truth be told, I was absolutely exhausted when it came to finishing it up, and I was just so tired I sort of passed out. So I'm very sorry for that. I'm going to try and be more diligent for the following week. So there you have it. I'll be hitting you up with a comment tomorrow, and we'll be back to our regular programming for Monday. But that's it from me. I'd like to extend a final thank you to my members and patrons, whose names can be seen on screen, who get some cool perks for signing up. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.